Today I want to talk about, in our 100% sermon series, I want to talk about God and parenting. God and parenting. Before I get into the details, let me say two preliminary remarks. Number one, my own, Ing and I, our kids are young, and we have no idea, as you can tell from the pictures, we have no idea how they're going to turn out. And I just want to say that off the bat because here I am talking about parenting when I'm right in the midst of parenting my little children. And so I know you probably have heard too, people who, they have all the answers, right? They have all the answers in the world until they're right in the midst of it or on the other side. And so I want to approach this issue for me personally as humbly as I can. And let me say it this way. Parenting, I think we could all agree, is hard enough without kind of some extra pressure from each other or judgment about how it's being done. And so we want to all be humble and open to help. Which leads to my second comment, which is this. Today's sermon is for everybody here. It's for everybody here. And so one way to think about this is that I'm not unaware of the fact that while a lot of churches meeting in our county today are filled with mostly silver-haired saints, that here at Kish, we have a good amount of silver hair and possibly some dyed hair and that kind of thing as well. I'm just saying. We also have a whole bunch of young families with little kids around, and that's not common. And I've said this before, but it's worth our while to recognize the fact that we have a gift. And if you know me, I don't cry very easily. But just a few minutes ago, when all those little kids were up here, and if you saw my son, he's dancing like a lunatic, I had some tears in my eyes just thinking of not just the beauty of the kids and the life and the vibrancy and the energy they give, but also of the responsibility. As we pray about Afghanistan and think about the crazy world that we're all struggling to deal with, COVID, Afghanistan, all the rest, and then we're bringing these children up into this world. And so we have an awesome privilege and responsibility here. And oftentimes as parents, we think about, parenting young kids, 2, 4, 6, 8, whatever. But there's another group of people here that I want to mention today, which is parents of adult children. Parents of adult children. And it doesn't escape my attention that oftentimes, even though the parenting is different, because you're not going to send them to the room or, you're not allowed to have a cake or whatever, that's different, but the challenges can still exist. And so I know plenty of adults who are struggling with estranged relationships with their adult kids, struggling through the complexities of grandchild, this kind of thing, just all sorts of challenges for those who are parenting older adults. And I want to recognize that today as well. And so while this sermon is for all of the technically parents out there, however that might be, it's also for all of those who are technically not parents. Why is that? One way to think about this is that I oftentimes send out emails or write correspondence, and we label it something like Dear Kish Family, right? Kish Family. And what that means is that in a very real sense, and I take this real seriously, in a very real sense, if you're part of the Kish family, then we have a family. Paul would say that we're no longer strangers and aliens, but we're members of the household of God. And that's a really awesome thing, because if you, let's say your family you grew up in stinks, or if they have passed away, or if they've moved away, or if you're here alone, or any of those kinds of things, then that means you actually have real relationships with a real family in our Kish family. And that privilege comes with responsibility. And so I think there's something like 55 or so little kids in some way, shape, or form that are connected to our church. And so not only do the technically parents of those kids have the responsibility for helping them come into this world that we're facing, but we all share some level of that responsibility. And so this sermon, it's not like, oh, I don't have any kids, so I can tune out. It's we all need to be working through this together, which involves humility and teamwork and all that kind of stuff. I'm not even going to go into detail today on why parenting is hard. I think my gut feel says that everybody out here kind of has a sense that, yes, parenting kids these days is a challenge. And I say these days, but it probably means all the time, right? no matter what the era or stage or dynamic in the world, parenting kids is a challenge. I will note that these days, one of the interesting things is that many less folks they're either not having kids or having fewer kids. And to me, that kind of speaks to the fear or challenge with the idea of bringing another human being into this world that we're part of. And so it's worth noting that if you're a parent of a child, you've at some level chosen to say, hey, I think it's worthwhile to bring a life into this world, and so then to take responsibility for that. And what I'm going to say today is that actually a message given by an old man, about 3,300 years ago, can actually be very helpful for us parenting today in the 21st century. In a minute, I'm going to have Celeste come up, and she's going to read our passage for today. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, basically the first half of that. And for all the little kids you saw standing up here, they were actually working through the story of the Exodus through VBS. So they're familiar, but if you weren't there, if you don't know that story, let me give you a background. So I'm guessing you might be familiar, but maybe not, with the story that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And they were enslaved in Egypt, and God used Moses and these 10 plagues to allow the Israelites to escape out of slavery, away from Pharaoh. They crossed the Red Sea or Reed Sea, and I won't go into all that. And then the waters crashed down on the on the Egyptians, and the Israelites made it through. Next thing you know, they're about ready to enter the Promised Land, and the message was kind of like, we're fearful to enter the Promised Land. We don't want to do it. We're scared. And so Moses says, well, then we're going to have to wait till this whole generation dies away. Once they all die away, a new generation will come, and then they can go into the Promised Land. And so where we find our passage today in Deuteronomy 6 is basically right at the spot where Moses is going to be speaking to this new generation. And he's going to be telling them kind of, in a very real sense, parenting them and saying, this is how to live life going forward and kind of going into the next stage, life with God. And so Celeste, if you want to come up and read now, she's going to read Deuteronomy 6, verses 1 through 9. And I want you to think about this like literally as a parenting text. Like, what does it look like to think about this related to parenting? So, thank you.
Are we on? There we are. Okay. Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9. I did think it was important to make sure that you realize that Moses had just told the people what the 10 Commandments were. You all know about the 10 Commandments, so you should understand that that was what just happened. And then this. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. I'm not going to go into this idea in here about multiply greatly. We did that last week. what I want to do today is I want to share 2 points and a bonus. So 2 points and a bonus. Here's point number 1, is to parent the heart. Parent the heart. Now, I'm going to give you kind of a flyby of this point for the sake of time, but if you want more details, I highly recommend, and I've done this before, Shepherding a Child's Heart by a guy named Ted Tripp. And if you saw a picture of Ted Tripp, he has a really giant, like, Magnum PI mustache, so it's hard to miss. But here's the basic idea. So Ted Tripp says this. He says that what we often do is we parent our kids and focus on external actions. We focus on external actions because we can control them easier. So what we do is we manage maybe by fear, and what we say to our kids is, do what I say or else, right? And I won't fill in the blank for you on the what else, but you get the idea. Or we parent by reward, which says, if you do this, then I will give you this, or let you do this, or take you here, or whatever. Or we parent by shame, which says, it's embarrassing for me when you do X, Y, or Z. And what the mustache guy says is that if you read Deuteronomy 6, it says that we're called to love the Lord our God with all our heart. And the issue comes that when you parent through manipulating external actions, you don't get to the heart, and there's no heart change. And so I've seen this kind of thing come to play in people's lives. For instance, do you ever see a situation where a kid grows up and then the parents say, I don't know what to do? They're rebelling, right? They've rebelled against the situation. And what I would say is, in that case, maybe they're not so much rebelling as maybe all of a sudden the ability to control their external actions in their house with their parents by fear or reward or embarrassment or whatever, that has all of a sudden gone away. And what's actually happening is their true heart is actually just coming right out. So I don't really believe in this sense that a kid gets to be 20 or 25, leaves the house and rebels. I think that what we do, is we all do, is we live out of the beliefs and motivations from within our heart. And the reality is, when we parent based on external motivations, what happens is that we can only manage our kid when we can control where they're at and what they're doing. And so this point says that we need to, and Moses says here, to love the Lord your God with all your heart. We need to make sure that our children are loving God and living out of a heart that is connected to God, so that when we're not there, they do the right thing. Because God is always there, but we can't always be there. Again, I don't have time to develop this as much as I wish, but what Ted says in the book is that to get to someone's heart, one of the key helpful things is to ask questions. You know? So, Abram, why did you hit your sister? What were you feeling when you did that? And when we invest in those questions, we teach our children to get to the heart of the matter. And when they get to the heart of the matter, they can see, what belief is it, right? I think that by hitting somebody, I can get what I want. That's their foundational belief. Or I think that the world is not going to see or notice or be involved in my life unless I exercise something by reward or by punishment or by fear or this kind of thing. And so we need to focus on the heart. And here's why this is crucial, really, is because when we get to the heart, we get to the gospel. Because the gospel says that God loves all these children and loves all of us completely and wholly where we're at. And if our heart is filled with that love, now we don't need to respond back in selfishness or in anger or in manipulation like we so often are tempted to do. It's kind of like, and this is what PD would always say, is that we have to focus on the roots of the tree and not the fruit of the tree. Focus on the roots and not the fruit. And I want to encourage us, as we think about parenting, whether you got the little ones or older kids or whatever, think about what's happening in people's hearts. Don't just focus on the external actions. All right, for the sake of time, like I said, I'm really interested today mainly in this second point. And the second point is this, that we should parent all the time. Parent all the time. It's not coincidental that Moses would write here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, that we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then what immediately follows that is a description of like, okay, well, how are we going to make sure our kids are going to do that kind of thing? And it goes on in verses 7 to say this. You shall teach them this idea of obeying God. You should teach them diligently to your children. You should talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as signs on your hands. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now, what's awesome about this, and if you understand kind of the Hebrew poetry sort of mindset, what's being described here is basically this. They're saying, instead of saying, oh, when should you do this? You should do it all the time. They're basically saying all the time by saying when you get up, when you lie down, when you walk, when you sit, like there's no other time than all of these things that are described right here. It is all the time. And I get pretty fired up about this. So let me try to explain it more clearly what I mean. In the 100% sermon series, we've been trying to communicate that what we often do is we separate out our spiritual lives. And over here is kind of like where I read the Bible and I pray and I go to church. And then over here is like our real lives. Okay? And we separate out those two things. Here's the spiritual stuff. Here's real life. Well, I would argue that in our parenting, we oftentimes do the exact same thing. The exact same thing. And here's what I mean. We say, well, what does a good Christian parent do? Well, a good Christian parent, they make sure their kid is in church. They make sure their kid goes to VBS, maybe goes to a Christian school. They make sure their kid goes to youth group, all these kinds of things. And we hand off the spiritual upbringing of our children to those other people. And I'll be over here, and I'll take care to make sure that they can tie their shoes, and they can play their sports, and they can do whatever other real-life stuff they need to do. And I'll just make sure these people handle this part, and I'll be over here doing this part. And what I'm not saying is that Laura and Chris and myself and all of us that are like involved in kind of the spiritual training for our work, that we don't care about our kids' spiritual lives. What I am saying is I think the same thing Moses is saying, which is, folks, it's just not enough. It's not enough for parents in this crazy world we live in to say, okay, let me hand the spiritual stuff over to some other professionals and I'll take care of real life. It's just not enough. Because Moses says that our kids need to hear about this kind of stuff 100% of the time. And you might ask me, why am I so confident about this, or why do I seem so passionate about this? And here's one of the reasons why. Ing and I met this summer with a bunch of post-high age kids, so like 20-year-olds, right? Some connected to our church, others not. And we asked a pretty simple question, which was this. How often in your houses do you talk about spiritual things? Every single one of those kids said we don't. Now, I don't know if that's just the particular group we had or this kind of thing, or if it gets awkward when kids get to be 16 or 18 or 20 or whatever. But and this is partly why I was in tears earlier today. So I'm thinking the world is crazy and we're raising our kids, and if we're not caring deeply about their spiritual health and about opening up the fact that 100% of their lives can be related to their spiritual life, then we're missing out on training them. We're saying something like, please be like us and just put your spiritual part over here and put your real life over here. And I didn't have this in my notes, but I'll just be, this is one of the things I've noticed, is this is especially important for dads. Because, Lord help us all, dads need to communicate to their kids, if you're a spiritual Christian person, that it's okay and good and right to talk about spiritual things within your families. I'll just set that aside. I'll leave that right there. So what does it look like to teach your kids to obey God and to love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength? And as Jesus would later add, love your neighbor as yourself. What does it look like to do that when you stand up and when you sit down and you walk along? What does that look like? Here's some applications for today. Number one, soak your kids in the stories of the Bible. soak your kids in the stories of the Bible. Here's why this is crucial. Every kid believes they're part of some big, huge story. And maybe that story is we were, evolved and we just kind of showed up here and you should just get out of life whatever you should get out of your life. Or maybe that story is the story that we find in the Bible. And if it's the story that we find in the Bible, then we want our kids to understand how that story goes so they can place their lives within the context of that bigger story. And so I would encourage you, Ing and I are big fans of this thing called the Children's Storybook Bible. What oftentimes happens, I think, is we give little kids a Bible and they can't really read yet or understand. It's just a little too much for a certain age. So that's a really helpful storybook to really get them invested in the stories and get the idea of the big picture of the Bible. Another thing is to read the Bible together, to talk about the stories of the Bible together, to share the stories of the Bible together. And I think, again, this is me taking a guess here, but I think that what happens is we oftentimes feel unprepared ourselves to talk through those things, so we just avoid that area as a total thing, and we hand it off to the professionals, like Chris and children's people and stuff. You guys deal with my kids in this area. Thirdly, this is just funny, I think, is name your plants after Bible characters. And so there's a family here in our church, and I won't say who, but the kid happened to get a couple hot pepper plants, and three of them, and he named them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you get that, then you have been immersed in the stories of the Bible, and you see why that all fits really well. And what I would say is that we all need to be entwined in the stories that happen in Scripture in funny and interesting and clever and whatever kinds of ways to show that we're part of that big story. Number 2, we need to think about 100% of your life with God and then share that with your kids. So I have a philosophy, it's not been necessarily proven too wrong yet, but that mostly what happens is our kids turn out to be about how we are, right? So it's a rare exception when a kid turns out to be, say, much better or much worse than their parents. What mostly happens is the kids turn out to be about how the parents are. And so if we want them to be able to see 100% of their lives as involved with God, then that's on us to have 100% of our lives involved with God, which has been kind of the sermon series we've been going through. Number 3, questions. I'm such a big fan of questions because oftentimes I think the parent-child relationship, and maybe this is sort of going away these days or whatever, but is something like, I'll tell you what you need to know and don't bug me. If you have a question, go ask somebody else or whatever. But in both directions, what I find is that right at night before bed, I'm there with my kids, and all of a sudden they'll start into some line of questions, and you might say, well, Pastor Luke, you've been to seminary. I still get more freaked out by the questions my kids ask me than questions people from church ask because they're so fascinating. They're thinking through things in such a authentic and real and challenging way. But we need to be, what's the other option is to just avoid those questions, and then they don't have a place to discuss what they actually believe. And so to answer questions and then also to ask kids questions. Like Ted Tripp said earlier, when you ask kids questions, you get to the heart of what is actually inside, what is motivating them to live the way they're going to live. And that really, really matters. Number 4 is pretty simple. Tell them you love them. Tell them you love them. When you think about parenting, God he's really awesome because he knew, he's going to place himself as the ultimate and best father. And so he knows that what a father ought to look like is somebody who then loves their children well. And yet, again, sorry, I'm going to be tough on dads. Guys sometimes think, I told you I loved you, and if something changes, I'll let you know, but otherwise you can just assume that that's still the case. When there's a bunch of little kids wondering, does my dad love me? Does my dad love me? Does my family love me? Does my mom love me? Etc. And so what I think we need to do is communicate over and over again through our actions and words that we love our kids. Because that's going to allow them to be raised in a place of safety and comfort and fullness of love that's going to emulate, right? It's not separate from our spiritual life. It's not a non-spiritual thing to tell your kids you love them. You're modeling the kind of love God the Father has for us when you love your kids in that kind of way too. All right, I said earlier I had 2 points and a bonus. Here comes the bonus. It's this. It's to parent as a failure. Parent as a failure. Later, and we didn't read it, but later in Deuteronomy 6, you can read it this afternoon or whatever, Moses says that if your kids ask you, like, why should I obey God? Like, why should I do all these things that you just told me I should do? Why should I love the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength? Why should I do that? Moses says that this is the God who saved you out of Egypt and is taking you into the promised land. And he says, remember what God has done for you, not primarily based on what you've done, not primarily based on your actions, because he's the kind of God who loves you regardless of how messed up you are. And if you haven't heard this before, the idea that God brings the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land is basically the Bible's picture version of salvation, what salvation in Jesus looks like. The idea is that we are enslaved to sin. We are enslaved to sin. And just like the Passover lamb provides kind of the freedom for the nation of Israel out of Egypt, Jesus' death and resurrection provides the freedom for us to be, the waters have crashed in on the slavery of sin, and we can go forward, and we have an eternally good future planned for us in this promised land. And Jesus cares about us and does all that despite the fact that we're an absolute mess, right? Despite our sinfulness. And so what my experience is as a parent, and if y'all are out here, I'm guessing it's something similar, is something along the lines of, this is the one area where we put so much pressure on ourselves to do everything right. Like you read on the internet and there's like 8,000 versions of what you should do when your kid's sick, or you can read these parenting books and it's like so overwhelming. Like, who has time to do all these kinds of things? Or you're trying to parent your kids well and manage your work and your relationship, and it just becomes overwhelming. Like, I have this fragile young child, and I'm trying to raise them, and I don't even know what to do, and I feel like I'm just doing this as a failure. Maybe y'all don't experience that, but I'll just say that I quite often feel exactly that way. And then you come to church today, and I yammer on at you and basically say something like, not only is there all that, but you also, as a Christian, need to parent so that you can help them love the Lord their God with all their heart, and you need to do it all the time, and you need to immerse them in the stories and ask questions and do all these other things. And it seems to me like the weight of that could come crashing down, and you could think that, this is just kind of judgmentalism, and it's just too much, and you just can't bear yourself up under all the pressure of what it takes to be a great parent. And I would say that's completely understandable, but this is why the gospel and the Christian view of parenting is so absolutely magnificent. Because unlike the 10,000 other cultural things that are going to say, on your own, you need to do this better, and this better, and this better, and this better, and this better, the Christian view says, you're already messed up, and you're probably going to be more messed up, and God still loves you anyhow. And matter of fact, he has more resources for you to be the best parent you can, and all you have to do is first start by admitting, right? We say in Christian circles, admit you're a sinner. Well, admit that you're not the world's greatest parent, right? Admit that I'm not the world's greatest parent, and ask God for help in the process of parenting. And so my hope for us here at Kish is that we can parent, and I just keep picturing these kids up here, all those lives who in some cases have already been, they've all already been stained with the effects of our sinfulness. And if we're going to say, oh, the pressure is on me to save them, you're not going to be able to do that, right? We're going to fail at that. But if we say something like, God, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need your help. I fail at this parenting thing. I'm not perfect, this kind of thing. Then a couple awesome things can come out of that. Number one, we can kind of save ourselves from the pressure of having to be the world's most perfect parents. Right? Like, we don't have to make sure that our kids have every perfect opportunity, everything set up as perfectly as best we possibly can, because we're going to be unable to do that, and we have already been unable to do that anyhow. Secondly, this is great. We get really excited about the gospel. Because if you say as a parent something like, I can't do this on my own, I need help, then you get excited about the gospel, which says that Jesus knew that anyhow. He wants to help you to become the best parent. And then all of a sudden, you're sharing with your kids 100% of the time about the gospel because you're really excited that Jesus is helping you to be a better parent. And you don't have to do it on your own. Thirdly, and this is the one that really gets me, is that kids end up respecting parents that parent this way better anyhow. Right? Because, and you can picture these people, I think you can picture these people in your heads. Those people who, it's my way or the highway, I never messed up, I'm not going to share any of my baggage with my kids, they're not going to know about that, I'll keep that secret and hidden, right? And I'm not saying it's age appropriate, that kind of thing, but when you do that, those kids grow up cynical and say, yeah, my parent was a facade, they weren't even like a real person, right? Like, they were perfect, they didn't need Jesus, I'm going to be the same way myself. And yet, on the other side, and I know some people here that are like this, who they've had their own messes in their own life history, and they've been open and vulnerable and share that with their kids. And what happens is, wonderfully, beautifully, because of the gospel, the kids end up respecting them more for sharing their failures with their children. And there's an awful lot more freedom when you're talking openly with your kids about your mistakes and that kind of thing. And so, I guess out of everything I said today, what I really hope kind of hits home at some level is that the Christian message of parenting is not adding another burden to say you need to do everything perfectly. It's adding a place where you can say, I'm not doing things perfectly, but I have a resource in God through Jesus who can help me. And I hope that provides some level of freedom for those of you who are weary and burdened with the task that is before us. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for these kids. What a privilege and an honor. And I know we always say something like, they're not our kids. We're just those who've been kind of gifted them. They're your children, and that we get to participate in their lives. And so I pray, Lord, that we wouldn't feel the burden to do that. We wouldn't be paralyzed by needing to do that perfectly, but we would instead be open to our own vulnerabilities and sinfulness in our parenting so that we can invite you into that process so that the gospel can go forward into these kids' lives and ultimately you would receive, not we as Parent of the Year kind of folks, but you would receive Parent of the Year award. Pray this all in your name. Amen.